What is up, guys? Welcome to Coffee with Gaz, where I drink my coffee and we have a chat about a particular coffee or particular topic. This coffee did have some nice crema on it and I was excited for that, but I actually started this video and then realized that, the audio wasn't connected, so I had to restart it. But there you go, that's life. So coffee doesn't look fantastic, but it is tasty. So today, guys, what we're going to be talking about is social media, and in particular, we're probably going to focus a little bit more on the perils of social media and particularly excessive social media use. I'm going to go through this from my own perspective in terms of the lessons that I have learned over the years as someone who has been very much involved in using social media use, mainly for the purpose of production, but also for the purpose of consumption. And I am someone who, has gained a lot in my life from using social media. In particular, I'll probably talk about Instagram because I think it is the platform that most of you probably spend most of your time on. It's really conducive to quite a bit of scrolling, and that seems to be where people spend a lot of their time. So I will focus a little bit more on that, given the kind of health and fitness audience. A lot of people do tend to kind of center in on Instagram. So yeah. Let me start by kind of giving you some rationale as to why you might want to listen to me on this topic. Firstly, this is a topic that has been requested many times for us to discuss at Triage, but in particular, my clients have discussed it with me. It's a topic that comes up all the time in coaching, because as we always say in relation to coaching, it's not just about advice about nutrition and training, it's also advice about lifestyle, and very often, the limits to making progress in terms of one's health and one's overall kind of success and whatever road they're on, it can be impeded, it can be hindered by excessive social media use. So it is something that comes up. But for me personally, over the years, I've used social media a lot, and I've spent a lot of time on Instagram. And if you were to look at the last 5 years, you'd probably see that up until 2018, I was spending hours and hours on Instagram every day, whether it be putting up stories, making custom posts, responding to people in the DMs, consuming content from others, and I definitely devoted a lot of my time towards that. And that's the case for many people, and even if you're not someone who produces content, many people still spend hours upon hours every day consuming content, very often content that is not necessarily making their life any better and can sometimes be for the worse. And that's really what we want to get at here. So when it came then to that kind of turning point in 2018 for me, at the beginning of 2018, basically what I said to myself was, and this was a very explicit thing, it was a very deliberate thing. It was something that, I very clearly made note of, that all of my decisions from then on for 2019 and 2020 so far, all of my decisions in terms of what I would do with my life, how I would set up and distribute my time, how I would allocate my time to different tasks in different areas of my life, etc., that all of those things would now be, all those decisions would now be made in line with what I want to be in 10, 20, 30 years, okay? And that sounds trivial, but it was basically that kind of moment of me saying, like, what do you actually want to be like, or who do you want to be, and what do you want your kids to see or to be able to describe when they're asked, tell me a bit about your father, what actually comes to mind. And that might sound trivial for some, maybe profound for others, but for me it was a very simple way of kind of refining the way that I spent my time, how I made decisions, etc. Because ever since then, I just come back to that. I'm like, all right, what kind of person do you want to be? Like, who do you want to be in 20 years? Who do you look up to now, and what can you take from them? And that was kind of key for me, because what I then did was kind of thought about all the people that I look up to, and I thought about what qualities I admire about them. And then I started to kind of, pick different things from different people, or archetypes, you could say, like some sort of ideal that I have in my head as to what a great person might be. And I started to think, okay, I want to start to embody those things. Very, very simple way of looking at the world, but it was just one of those things like, right, this is a really simple way of making decisions, so why don't I start to do that? So yeah, I started to do that anyway, without kind of going too long on that tangent. That's not the purpose of this video. But when I began to do that, like, one of the clear things that emerged from that was why are you spending so much time on social media, and how much of this is truly for your benefit and for your long-term development? And that was kind of when I started to realize that, you know, a lot of the time I was spending on social media, a lot of the time I was spending supposedly providing value to others, was sort of me kind of, I was justifying it, you know, because the thing in my case is that for many of you, you don't use social media for solely production purposes, you know. So the vast majority of my time on social media was solely for production purposes. So I was always able to justify it, you know. If I was ever on my phone and, you know, my mom was giving out to me, or a friend was saying, would you ever get off your phone? I could just say, oh, you know, I'm working, you know, and constantly justifying that and rationalizing with that explanation or that excuse. And when it came to that point in 2018, then I had to say to myself, you know, is that actually true? Like, is that actually true? How much of what you have in life now and what you will have in 10, 20, 30 years is actually dictated by these hours you're spending on social media every day? And for me, that was the time to say, you know, actually, you know, I'm kind of lying to myself here. I'm kind of telling myself fibs, you know, and a lot of the time that I was spending on social media, like, yes, it may have been beneficial in some contexts for, you know, the development of our business and for the purpose of providing information to people, but the vast majority of it could probably have been cut and has since been cut without much of a detriment to the things that actually matter to me in my life, and the time could then be spent on the things that will contribute to the longer term. And that is effectively what I've been trying to do since that time in 2018. And over the course of those 2 years, from kind of, you know, 2018, especially 2019, and so far in 2020, what I started to do was gradually like pull back on the social media. So in 2018, I don't think I was that successful with it. You know, I definitely spent more time off of Instagram, periods where I wasn't posting as much, you know, not feeling like I always had to, but I was still very much in that world. And then as it came to 2019, I started to say to myself, look, this kind of moderation approach is kind of bullshit. You need to be more real with yourself. And that was the point at which I kind of reread some books that I had read before. I read Cal Newport's Deep Work and Cal Newport's Digital Minimalism. And I think I read that twice in 2019 and once so far in 2020. And constantly trying to kind of reinforce that idea and call myself out on the rationalization that I was going through. And as 2019 went on, I spent more and more time without, you know, using Instagram. I started to delete my account or deactivate my account for a number of months, and I've been doing the same in 2020. It's been deactivated for most of 2020. And that's basically the way I've been trying to treat that, to try and allocate more time towards the things that really matter to me. And now I'm in a position where I'm able to, I've been allocating a lot of my time more productively. I've been, you know, quite successful in terms of my studies in the past year. Been, you know, now that the exams are over and the academic year is finished, I'm able to allocate far more time to producing content for Triage, such as these videos and a lot of writing that I'm doing and stuff like that. And I've also started to read a lot more. I've been absolutely milling it through books at a pace that I never could have expected to read books before. Same can be said for podcasts, allocating time to the relationships and the people that matter to me in my life, taking up jiu-jitsu. All these different things started in that period of time and have seriously benefited my own personal life. So this isn't supposed to be a video about me. It's supposed to be a video in which I kind of show you why I have come to this point, and why I think there are some things to be learned from that. So with all of that said, why bother or why consider the cons of social media, and what are the drawbacks that are likely to be affecting your life? So the first thing that really does pop up for me with the vast majority of my clients and the people that I speak to and the people I know in my own life and myself in the past is you're wasting a shitload of time, okay? And time is realistically your most valuable resource. Many of us end up being quite time poor, and it excuses us from doing many of the things that could potentially make our lives better, whether that be, you know, preparing healthful nutrition, whether it be getting more training in, reading more books, listening to more podcasts, listening to more audiobooks, writing more, spending more time with our significant other, you know, learning a new skill. Whatever it is, there are always these things in our lives that we're saying, you know, I'd love to do that if I had time. And the reality of the situation is that if most of you go into your usage statistics on your iPhone or any other phone, you'll probably see that you're spending like 3, 4, 5, 6 hours, 7 hours in some cases per day on your phone. And when you begin to see what that time is actually spent on, a lot of it is probably spent, you know, scrolling Instagram, scrolling Twitter, scrolling Facebook. I know that some of you are not in that position. I had some people contact me after some of the emails we put out in our Triage newsletter, and they said, you know, I've been off the grid for 10 years. You know, I haven't used any social media in like 10 years. And basically what I've been doing is I've been trying to just, you know, create, I said no social media, but what some people do is they create, you know, silent accounts on which they don't post, but they'll follow a select amount of accounts that from which they can, you know, really start to get some value. And that is purposeful social media use. So there are some people who do that, but the vast majority of us are scrolling mindlessly. We wake up in the morning, we take out our phones, we scroll, 30 minutes has gone by. 30 minutes is enough to have gotten a very productive workout. It's enough to get pages and pages of reading done, some writing done, you know, all of these different things that could potentially improve our lives. And instead we're kind of getting this very cheap form of, you know, reward. It's a very cheap way of getting the reward that would normally require us to put in a lot of effort to get that same feeling, kind of, you know, neurobiologically, and that's just cheap. You know, it's a cheap return, and it's a quick return, and there's nothing lasting from it. So that's the big concern for me, is the fact that many people are spending their time on something that is not actually accumulating into anything in the long term. So it's very much just that feeling in the short term. So that's kind of the first thing, is the time question. So if you are an individual who, you know, you feel you are time poor and you would like to be able to allocate your time better to some other area of your life, you have to ask yourself, what exactly are you getting from social media? What exactly are you getting from scrolling Instagram? And even in the cases where you rationalize it and where you say, you know, oh, I get value from this person, do you really? Because what I find is that some people, and this includes me in the past, we follow people who, you know, we say, oh, they always provide me with value. But when you actually ask yourself, what do I do differently in my life as a result of following this person? Or what do I know that I didn't previously know? And does this require the hour per day that I spend on their content? You might find that the answer is just, oh, I'm actually just bullshitting myself and they're not really adding much to my life. They may have at one point, and I may like them as a person, but that doesn't mean that you owe them anything. They're no different than your relationship with Triage, your relationship with me. I don't expect you to just consume my content because you like me as a person. If this is wasting your time, hit pause and go and do something productive. So yeah, the time thing, that really is a big one. The next one, the next kind of peril of social media that's it's especially pervasive at the moment, is the inability to think for yourself, and basically the inheritance of a set of values, you could say, a set of judgments, a set of beliefs that come from a collective that you have chosen to follow or that have been suggested to you without you necessarily having to do much thinking for yourself. And that for me is quite dangerous. I need some caffeine for this one. And the reason that I say that is dangerous is because you're just not doing any thinking. Okay, so you're not actually thinking through problems for yourself, and you never actually go to the primary source of information. And obviously, this is absolutely not unique to social media. This is a problem with media in general. And if you were to, you know, look at two stories, you know, obviously most people are familiar with kind of American media. If you were to look at two stories and how they were presented on CNN versus Fox, you would get totally totally divergent presentations of information that you would hope could be potentially objective. And the thing that's interesting about that is that one side will still have this story that I'm telling you, because people who, you know, maybe they subscribe to CNN and they like that school of thought, what they'll say is, oh my God, media is so biased. You know, have you seen the way this was presented on Fox News? And the people that watch Fox News all the time will say the exact same thing in return, not realizing that both of you are basically experiencing the exact same problem. You're succumbing to the exact same flaws, and you're basically two sides of the same coin, and that is the fact that you are inheriting a set of beliefs, you're inheriting a comfortable narrative for your worldview without actually having to do any thinking or searching for potential primary sources of information. And I'm not going to get into media stuff in specifically, like that's not the goal of this, but rather to say that this is exactly what happens on social media too. It's what happens on Instagram, it's what happens on Facebook and Twitter. You know, you are suggested, or you receive suggestions as to, you know, who you should follow and what articles you might like and what videos you might like based on what you've exposed yourself to previously. And this leaves you in a position in which you end up in a filter bubble, as it's called. And when you end up in this kind of filter bubble, both consciously and subconsciously, or unconsciously rather. I say unconsciously because obviously the algorithms of social media are set up to provide you with information that you're likely to enjoy, that's likely to be of use to you based on what you've been exposed to previously. At least in most cases. Obviously there's nuances to how social media algorithms work and exceptions, etc. But that's the kind of unconscious side. But also there's the conscious side, and this is the part where I think it can make you quite fragile to how the real world actually works. And this is what is quite dangerous in my mind, is that what you can effectively do on social media, one of the best things and the worst things, is that you can choose exactly what narratives you want to receive. So if you have, you know, a particular political bias, if it's politics you're talking about, you're likely to follow all of the people that, you know, that independent of the algorithm, you're going to seek out people that have beliefs that are very similar to yours. That's what happens a lot of the time. And as a result, your whole network of information distribution or provision ends up being just confirmatory. So it just constantly fits this real nice, you know, aligned worldview, this real nice worldview that seems really convenient. It's a nice narrative, it's a story. And it reinforces this idea that the world should be easily explainable. You know, that you should be able to say that, you know, oh, this is the way the world works, you know, X equals Y equals Z, and you know, A and B and C are bad, etc. Like, these are the types of stories that we like to tell ourselves when we start to create, again, consciously and unconsciously, an information distribution network that is solely aligned with what we already believe, what we already think, what we want to be true. Okay, and this is what ends up happening. And the danger of that is obviously quite apparent to anyone who is familiar with, you know, how we use science, let's say, in the nutrition world. Obviously, if you were to follow certain low carb, I always use the low carb community as my scapegoat because they're just kind of an easy example. If you were to go and follow all the low carb and keto type people on Twitter or Instagram or whatever, you can start to create this real nice, convenient worldview, this real nice narrative about how the world works and about how health works and how medicine works, etc. That just says, you know, excuse me, carbohydrates bad, protein and fat good, big pharma bad, full stop, right? That's it, you know, real nice, simple way of understanding the world. So now when I'm presented with any sort of problem that I have to wrestle with, I put it through my low carb filter. So, you know, you're presented with this problem and now you've got this filter, and once it goes through that filter, it comes out the other side. And when it comes out the other side, it's a real nice, convenient story that you're able to tell yourself because you know you've got that filter between the new information and the end product of that information once you've put it through that filter. And that's what's dangerous for me, because like personally, like one of the things that I'm most interested in is trying to find out what's true, you know. And that's obviously the case for anyone who's interested in science, in epistemology, in philosophy. You know, if you're interested in those things, you'd hope that, you know, truth is some sort of thing that you'd want to move towards in life. And the harsh reality is that the world is quite complicated, that it is really, really, really difficult to navigate the world and create these nice narratives, and that the world is a much nicer and more friendly place when you think that things work along your nice aligned worldview. Because basically what you can do then is you can start to put your blinkers on, because you've got your filter, you block out information that is contradictory with your priors, with your worldview. And as a result, you never have to actually change anything, because you can constantly live in that way. And you would hope that if you're just talking about benign issues, that it doesn't actually affect the health of others, and it just allows you to kind of, you know, go ahead and live your life, and that's fine. You know, not all of your beliefs have to be true, objectively true, for them to benefit your life in some way. That's an important distinction. But there are cases where if you are just willing to create a convenient narrative for yourself and ignore what is actually true, that you can begin to degrade the lives of others, and you can begin to, you know, spread falsehoods and vote for people who could potentially be harmful politically, and they're the real dangers at the end of this. And I'm after going very fucking off topic there now, and I don't know what I was saying. The point of all of that is that the world is always going to be more contradictory, more complicated, and than you would like it to be. There's always going to be a lot of uncertainty, and I'm not saying that you can't begin to appreciate that by using social media, because you can. You absolutely can. And personally, what I try to do is I try to make sure that who I do follow, that there's, you know, there's contradictions within there, and that, you know, if I go to you know, some of the people I follow on Twitter, I know that they will have a different perspective in advance to the other people, and as a result I can create some sort of composite understanding of those two people on those two sides. And then once I can kind of appreciate both sides of what they're saying, it gives me a better net understanding of what the situation actually might be, you know, because you can actually start to appreciate the different worldviews. You can start to appreciate, you know, the incentives that are in place for both of those people to have those beliefs and express those beliefs on either side of that spectrum. And then you'd hope that you can get closer to truth that way. And that obviously a more applied example in the nutrition field would be to, you know, not just like I said earlier, that I use the kind of low carb community as a scapegoat for kind of, you know, an ideological perspective of nutrition. But it's not enough to just say, okay, a lot of them have shitty beliefs, so I'm not actually going to follow them at all. Like, that's a really bad way of approaching this. I follow lots of people who put out information related to the carnivore diet and low carbohydrate diets on Twitter, because I like to be in that circle so I know what they're saying. Because the chances are that the people who have low carbohydrate and keto biased beliefs, that they get some things right, and there's something there to be said. Same thing on the opposite side of the spectrum. If you have, you know, real kind of militant vegans, obviously vegan diets can be very healthful, but when you've got people who are quite extremists who say that, you know, any animal products are just, you know, so harmful for your health, you know, those types of people. There's things that they will say that I know will be of value, and there will be research papers and odd findings in the scientific literature that both camps, that they will pick up, that both of those people will find these exceptions, and then that starts to inform, okay, you know, why is that the case? You know, why are all these people having success? You know, obviously the low carbohydrate community, they've produced a lot of, obviously a lot of it is just, it's anecdotes, you could say, but there are specific cases where individuals have gone on a low carbohydrate diet that has been high in protein, and you can see that they've, you know, massively improved their health. And if you can take away from that okay, there's something there. You know, that person lost 100 pounds. You know, why exactly might that be the case? And then you look to the opposite side of the spectrum and you see that, okay, there's people on vegan diets that are achieving the exact same thing. So there's something going on there. You know, neither of these things are the single truth in isolation. And once you can begin to see that, you start to realize that, oh, there's actually a lot more. There's a lot more to this whole understanding the world thing, and these convenient narratives just aren't good enough. And that also applies to the, I don't know, would you call them militant centrists, you know, the evidence-based people who, let's say in the nutrition world, where we say, you know, let's say you've got your kind of vegans on one side, and let's say you've got your carnivore people on the other side, and then you've got maybe the evidence-based people in the middle. This isn't a spectrum, but you know, you kind of are probably familiar with these camps, and you've got the kind of evidence-based people who will say that, you know, and I say evidence-based kind of in inverted commas because you're kind of probably familiar with what I'm talking about. They'll say things like food choices, you know, it doesn't really matter what foods you eat, just, you know, hit your calories and hit your macros and boom, it's kind of like this top-down understanding of the world where, yeah, we know that these things are objectively true and that you need to hit your calories and you hit your macros, and as a result, they're kind of like, yeah, just do that and that's fine. You know, that's the way that we understand the world. And, you know, after that, like these people on either side of the spectrum, they're idiots. You know, and obviously that's a straw man, and it's a caricature, but that's the purpose here, is to kind of begin to realize that there can be merits to these different camps. And when you can begin to see the merits and also appreciate that that's not a single worldview that is going to give you the objective truth, you know, when you can start to do that, what you can start to do then is then create that kind of composition, like I was talking about, where you take the good parts of all of the different camps, and you start to say, okay, what incentive structures might be in place for each of these people to hold their respective beliefs so militantly, and how does that then present with flawed logic and ignorance and cherry picking? Because that is what happens, you know, because once you start to create a simple perspective of how the world works, as I said earlier, you start to filter out the information that is not useful, or that is not in line with your kind of preconceived notions about how the world works, and then you will start to cherry pick any finding that might in any way support your worldview. And that's how you get further and further away from truth in most cases, unless, you know, it's just coincidence that you happen to have found some exception that, you know, the scientific consensus, you could say, had not already kind of convened upon. So let me take a sip of the coffee. So that was an awfully tangential monologue, right? So yeah, obviously that was kind of a bit off topic, because that doesn't necessarily just relate to social media. That also relates to how you get information in the real world. And I say in the real world in terms of like when you're actually talking to physical people, or when you're part of a particular community that holds particular beliefs. It could be certain, you know, religious doctrines or whatever. If you've got certain cultural practices in your region, you know, again, asking yourself what incentive structures are in place for me to hold these beliefs. Like, what purposes could they serve beyond solely what they state on paper? And then you can start to kind of understand a little bit more about, right, how did we get here? What might actually be true? And basically just the bigger picture of how we convene on these rules of how we should live, and the stories that we're told about how the world works. So with all that said, that was basically the intent there, was to kind of show you how social media and in particular the way in which we use social media, and social media uses us, so that kind of conscious and unconscious way in which we end up with the communities that we follow, basically to demonstrate how that can lead you astray and how to kind of combat that. So yeah, like the point there being that if you are going to use social media, if you're going to use Instagram, if you're going to use Twitter, if you're going to use Facebook, what I would encourage you to do is to try to step beyond the boundaries of the ideas that you're already comfortable with, and step beyond that kind of filtering layer that you have of, you know, information distributors. Because if all of your information distributors are saying the exact same thing, you might be missing out on something, and your worldview might be incomplete at best, or totally false and misguided at worst. So yeah, that is just something that's worth keeping in mind. Obviously, we can talk a little bit more about managing those things in a specific video, because I've dedicated enough time to them in this. But kind of taking all of that together with what we've said so far, what I'd like you to realize is that you can absolutely use these platforms to improve your quality of life, but very often the way that these platforms work, they do not necessarily incentivize them being for your benefit, or they don't necessarily incentivize behavior that is likely to lead to you, you know, just living your best life. Because obviously there's an incentive structure in place there to, like, firstly lead to point number one that we were discussing, which was spending as much time as possible on these platforms, whether that be the use of likes, in particular, you know, the color, the red heart, you know, when you get liked, whether it be the DMs, whether it be the constant flow of stories on Instagram, so that even if there aren't new posts, there might be new stories. All of these different things that basically incentivize you spending more time on the platform, but also that there's that the platforms are set up in such a way that you are far more likely to end up in a position where all of your beliefs are being confirmed and maybe not challenged, as you are to end up with a diverse information distribution network, you know. And the point there being that, you know, people talk about this stuff all the time, but they do it through the lens of their own worldview. So, you know, if you're talking about politics and you're kind of really simplifying things down to the kind of left-right spectrum, if you're someone on the left, you spend all your time mocking everyone on the right and about how they just confirm their own biases. But then if you're on the right, you do the exact same thing. And that's definitely a trap I've fallen into in the past in terms of, you know, exposing myself to certain worldviews. But as you begin to broaden it out and broaden it out and broaden it out, you start to end up in this position where you're just like, Jesus, why do things have to be so much more complicated than they were when I held my kind of more dogmatic beliefs, when I could kind of put myself in one particular position and I knew who believed similar things like me. And you end up in this position where you're just like, well, Jesus, I hardly know what I believe. I hardly know what to think. And yeah, cool. Okay, that's squared away. The final thing that we want to move on to is the way that these things start to actually change the way that you behave in the real world. Okay, so the reason this kind of comes to mind for me is because I have definitely observed my own behavior, my own desires to do certain things and go certain places. I've observed them be influenced by, you know, whether or not I could post a story, you know, about that thing, whether or not I could get a good picture opportunity out of it. These different things that I've noticed in myself over the years, and also another key thing there, because I'm talking about how it kind of changes or modifies the way that I behave in the real world. Another thing would be when searching for information or trying to learn something new, what I would find myself sometimes doing is trying to come to a quick understanding so that I could put it out in a post conveniently, or so that I could put it in a series of stories. Because again, it's that incentive structure that is in place for me to have a narrative that I can forward on to others, because having a clear narrative and clear recommendations is obviously what gets rewarded. Because if you put up a series of stories on Instagram that says, someone asked me this question and this is my current understanding, basically not really sure whether or not, you know, this is true or this is true or this is true, it kind of seems to be all over the place, there's not a clear answer. that's not going to get the same response, the same traction as a very stern, hard point, strict line in the sand with your position. And that doesn't matter what the specific position actually is, because even in the case that you're grossly incorrect, that's going to get more traction. And even in the case that you're absolutely correct and your points are absolutely on point, again, great traction there. But that kind of uncertainty, that point of I don't know and this seems uncertain and I'm not entirely sure, or not posting at all, that stuff doesn't gain traction. So as a result, you end up with these kind of incentives in place for you to try to summarize your worldview and try to come to some sort of position so that you can attract other people, and the other people will know that you have a good grasp of this topic, especially if it was a topic that they didn't have a good grasp of. So yeah, they're definitely the things that I would be quite critical of myself as I look back over the years, and I think, what were the mistakes that you made when using social media, and they would definitely be two things that will be up there. So, not spending enough time in the moment, so to speak. If I was on holidays or something, thinking about, right, let's get a story, let's get a picture, that type of stuff. And then in terms of learning and trying to, seek out new information, that sort of, it's a real subtle thing, but it's that kind of need to have a position, need to have some sort of statement that you can make or summary that you can have of your position. Especially, like, that's definitely more so the case for someone who's producing content than someone who's using social media solely for consumption. Because as you begin to produce content and become someone who's relied upon for producing content, you end up with a different set of incentives than someone who's solely consuming content. Because if you are that producer, you're suddenly thinking about how you're going to produce that content, what parts of your life could potentially be useful from a content perspective. So yeah, there's probably some irony or hypocrisy there in terms of me talking about my social media experience on a YouTube video. Basically using my critique of all of that for the purposes of content production. But there you go. So yeah, that's this has been quite the monologue, and I definitely went way off track versus what I planned to discuss in this video. But I've wanted to do a video about this topic for a while, and I thought that there'd be some useful take-home points for you. And finally, the final thing to touch on is not reasons or anything like that, but rather action points. And the key action points that I would have for someone that is trying to scale back, moderate their social media use, or be more deliberate with how they use social media, would be to first start to screen your use. Okay, so actually ask yourself, right, first, how many hours per day am I spending on my phone? Okay, and laptop, if you use social media a lot on your laptop. It's mostly phones these days. Start with that. Ask yourself what platforms you're using. Ask yourself, what benefits am I getting from each of these respective platforms that I use? And then actually ask yourself, are the benefits, like the payoffs that you're 100% sure on, like the payoffs that you can see in the real world in your life, are they worth the trade-offs? Because that's ultimately what you have to ask yourself is, what are the pros, what are the cons, and is that worth it? Because if you're saying to yourself that, oh, I kind of learn a bit more about makeup when I go on social media because I follow some makeup influencers. If you're saying that, but you're doing your makeup the same way as you were 3 years ago, and you're also spending 3 hours a day on Instagram, and it leaves you with this kind of background feeling of anxiety, and you're constantly reaching for your phone and you can't be without your phone, I would say that that's probably not a worthwhile trade-off, but that's obviously up to you. And then like, you can go through all that stuff, it's kind of common sense, how much do I use it, what platforms do I use, what benefits do I gain from them, what are the drawbacks of using these platforms, and then deciding finally, the final step is like, all right, what will I actually keep then? So basically your intent should be to go hard on yourself. Like, if you're using a platform and it's clearly the trade-offs are worse than the benefits, delete it. You don't need to be there. Obviously, content production is a little bit different, and that's the only reason that I still have a Facebook account, that I have, you know, an Instagram account. Twitter is the only type of social media that I use for consumption purposes, because I follow a lot of researchers, I follow a lot of doctors, and as a result, I'm able to get information there. Excuse me. Also follow quite a few independent journalists and stuff like that. So as a result, I can get information about things related to, you know, politics, current affairs, but also, you know, science, you know, in the areas that I'm interested in, whether it be exercise physiology, nutrition, whatever. My own academic studies in terms of, you know, medicine, following doctors and medical researchers, medical scientists. So as a result, I'm able to use that very much for consumption purposes, because there's a very clear, large payoff there. And because I don't use it much for production purposes, I'm not like doing DMs and stuff like that. I'm not spending lots of time typing posts. I'm just going on, I'm saying, all right, that research paper is of interest, boom, save for later, right? Oh, cool, I want to watch that video later. Oh, that's actually a good take on current affairs. I like that take. I might consider that more now. And then, oh, Jesus, that contradicts the previous point. Let's explore that idea a little bit. That's interesting. That broadens my perspective on things. You know, that's kind of how I use Twitter. But Instagram, I don't think it's as good for that, because obviously, like, people don't share, you can't share links, like it's not like clickable links, and yeah, I think there's just a different demographic in general. But what was I saying? Oh yeah, basically what I was saying was that, you know, you have to ask yourself how you use each of these respective platforms. Ask yourself, you know, what can I actually get rid of? Get rid of what isn't benefiting you. Keep the things that are genuinely benefiting you when you're being totally honest with yourself. And then what you have to do thereafter is to start to, you know, be deliberate with how you're going to use them. So the platforms that you're keeping, and a lot of these ideas are inspired, by the way, by Cal Newport. His book Digital Minimalism, highly recommended. But once you decide on what platforms you're going to use and the ones that are of benefit to you, you then have to ask how you're going to use them. So for example, if you know that for the last hour when you're in bed at night and the first hour when you're in bed in the morning, you always feel shitty after that, you don't feel good when you use social media at those times, then you might have to say to yourself, okay, I put my phone away at 9 p.m, I don't pick it up until 9 a.m, and I leave it in a different room while I'm sleeping. Then you can start to be more deliberate with how you're using it and when you're using it. It might be the case that you just use it at weekends, because realistically, if you're just using it to keep up with, you know, current affairs, you know, you can get a good perspective on how the overall week has been in the areas that you're interested in, rather than just checking every single day. And that's especially the case if you have particular people that you follow. So at the moment, what I'll do is, I don't go on my own Instagram, but I'll go onto the Triage Instagram, and I might search for a couple of pages, a couple of people that I'd like to see what they're saying about things, or I'd like to see if they're doing anything new, because I think there might be value to be had there. Another way you can actually do that is to, if there's not that many people, and it's just like there's only actually a few people that I'd like to follow, would be to, you know, create that kind of fake account, you know, an anonymous account, and just follow those 5, 10, 15, 20 people, and just check on them once a week. You know, they're just ideas. So that is what I would be saying to you. If you're someone who's using it for the purposes of production rather, this also applies here. Because what you could do is say that I have a specific time each day at which I write my social media posts, and I post them at that time. You can also use specific apps like we do at Triage. We use buffer.com so that we can schedule our posts at particular times for particular platforms without having to be on the app. So I'm not left in a position where, you know, I've got my phone, I'm doing a Triage post, and suddenly I'm scrolling stories for 30 minutes. You know, that doesn't happen, because I'm posting it from the laptop, and it's like, boom, that's it, that's squared away onto the next job. So yeah, you can use things like that. You know, Buffer there's many other, I think Hootsuite is another one. There are different platforms for distributing content across multiple platforms without you having to actually be on the app. What you could also do is, if you're someone who's into producing Instagram stories, is like if you're producing text stories or recorded stories, you could have, a specific day per week or days on the week where you type up your stories, and then you basically go on the app, you post them, and you get off, and you give yourself a few hours, and maybe you have an hour free later, and then you say, okay, I'm going to see what the responses were to the stories, and then I'm going to use that time to screen those responses, get back to people, answer any questions, etc. Basically, the whole point is to be deliberate, because if you're letting this run randomly, it will tear you apart. And one of the places that popped up the most for me is that kind of feeling of background anxiety, because you've got this, especially when you're producing content, you get this kind of experience where you know that you have put your views out into the world, you know that you've put up all these stories, and even when you're not on the app, you know that people are consuming that content, and you know that they're going to be responding to it. So you constantly have this urge to, check, I wonder what people are saying, I wonder, especially if you had already been messaging someone, you want to know, did they get back to me? Or, are they typing? Or what are they thinking? That sort of stuff. And it's very unnatural, so to speak, for you to be thinking about all of these people who you may never have met, about what they think about you right now and whether or not they have gotten back to you, when in fact you might never meet this person in the real world. And obviously you can just say that, oh, that's just a naturalistic fallacy, who cares if it's unnatural. But personally, like I put weight in that. I like to think about, all right, is this a bit weird that I'm engaging with people online like this, and I'm letting them infiltrate my thoughts, even though they're not necessarily people that I would allocate the same time to in real life. And like, that's not an insult, but this is the way, this is what happens sometimes, especially if you're someone who has a lot of followers. You'll have trolls, you'll have people who message you kind of asking for a lot from you, very clearly not being willing to give you anything in return, and if you're giving 45 minutes of your time in the DMs to try and explain something to someone who's being ignorant to you, like I found myself in that position before, where I've definitely been over giving, giving a lot of my time to getting back to people and publishing stories and answering people's questions, etc. And sometimes you don't get that much in return, and that's fine if you have the spare time to allocate to those things. But if you don't have that spare time and it's taking away from things that actually matter, for like your ability to pay your bills, or to nourish your relationships, or to get fitter and get healthier, etc., that's when those trade-offs start to really dominate your life. So yeah, guys, look, I'm going to leave it there because this video has been too long, but hopefully that there has been something in here that has at least got you thinking about your own personal social media use, whether it be the time you spend on the app or apps, whether it be the way in which using social media can affect your beliefs and understanding of the world, or any of the tips that came thereafter, in terms of the actual applied information, the trade-offs, the benefits. These are the things that you need to explore yourself. And like I said at the beginning, when I was kind of going through how I started to make decisions based on what I want to be, who I want to be in the future, you need to do that yourself too. You need to be deliberate with the way that you live your life. You need to ask yourself, who do I want to be? How am I going to get there? Is spending 5 hours a day on Instagram going to get me there? And then start to make your decisions accordingly. So look, I'm 25 years old. I'm figuring out all this stuff as I go. Technology is has obviously been evolving at a fast pace in the past 10 years. From when I was 15 to now when I'm 25, things have changed a lot, even in that short period of time. Even if you look at how Instagram has changed in that time, how Instagram use has changed in that time, it's very, very different. And it will undoubtedly continue to evolve, and you will if you're not deliberate about that, or about how you use technology, you'll be dragged along for the ride. Because what you have to realize is that you have people working in social media companies who are trying to get as much of your attention as possible. That's the incentive, and if you're just being pulled along for the ride, that is directly taking away from your quality of life and your potential to be the person that you want to be. So yeah, don't let social media companies pull the strings. But you needn't throw the baby out with the bathwater either. If you're someone who notices that social media has very much benefited your life, but don't use that justification without trying to be very deliberate with how you use these technologies. So guys, I hope that was an informative Coffee with Gaz. It's the longest one yet. It is more like a podcast episode, but you know, put me on double speed in future. You can do that down the bottom right of the screen. I always do that when listening to people, but I hope you enjoyed the video, guys. And I'll be back to talk to you again soon. Of course, remember to be happy, and of course, remember that it is too easy.